This panel will be somewhat smaller or shorter than originally anticipated because of the length of the previous one and because of the need to sort of catch up on the schedule. But what I'd like to do is the following, is to have a few questions thrown out, to have each person have a chance to step in from their position, what they do and how they understand these problems, and then we will then open it up to the House in general terms. I'll just say a few things on my own account. Basically, the history of modern art has been a struggle between the idea of art for art's sake and the idea of engagement. Usually the art for art's sake people are people who have previously been involved in complex social structures and found them inhibiting and decided to break away from the academy or from the mandates of their society, their governments and so on, and sought freedom in the arts and therefore sought to build a protective wall around the arts for that freedom. But then circumstances throw people into situations of crisis and they become politicized all over again. We're seeing that happen right now. So that people who previously had made work that may have seemed rarefied to the general population suddenly find themselves in circumstances where they are doing work in public ways and engaging the public as a medium or as a resource also. And that, as I said, is something increasingly happening now. What was performance art once upon a time, happening in small venues all around the world, is now happening in big places, like, for example, Tania Bruguera doing a microphone event in Havana and being shut down by the government. Now, what I want to do is simply open up that whole can of worms and have people talk about that shift back and forth, who's in control of the process of reaching out to make art in public situations, and as I say, also with the public. There's much conversation about who has the right to do this. What gives any particular artist the right to enter into the reality of some particular group and make art out of it? Does one need to be a member of that group? Does one need to be close to it in any particular way? If that were the case, there are huge problems aesthetically with the limits that you place on what artists do. On the other hand, there are clearly cases of where people have done things that presume too much. And just the other night, I was watching an old Elvis in Las Vegas film, in which in the 1970s, Elvis sang a song about the blacks, the fate of young black men in the ghetto. Nowadays, that would be absolutely intolerable. It's actually a pretty good song. And since I grew up on the south side of Chicago and I remember hearing it at the time, I remember thinking, oh, finally somebody's written a song about this. So what we now think is acceptable was not acceptable once upon a time, or maybe vice versa. So all of these things are whirling around. And then the last thing I'll throw out there as a sort of general proposition is that it seems to me there is no question but that philanthropy has increasingly set agendas for artists. And the question is philanthropy changing the direction of art in a positive way, or is it luring artists down a series of paths that may not work well? And just again, autobiographically, I once worked for the Mexican mural painter Siqueiros. I thought I was going to be a heroic mural painter. It was not my thing, okay? Now, there are people who've made great paintings in that zone, and I don't dismiss that kind of art, but each artist must identify for themselves what their real vocation is. And one of the artists I admire the most is an abstract painter of American origin, Ad Reinhardt, who made very political art as a cartoonist, political cartoonist, and who made completely apolitical art as a painter. And one can also have a bifurcated identity, or even subdivided beyond that, of how you practice your art, who you think you are as an artist, and who people think you are as an artist. And I would like to just sort of throw all these examples out, boop, boop, helter skelter, and ask sort of the general question of, do people think now that there is a bigger desire among artists than in previous times, or in recent times anyway, to engage directly in public problems? With this caveat, when the title of this came out, it is Art in Regions of Conflict. I would say that art is almost by definition a region of conflict. So if I can just throw that out, and whoever wants to grab the first loose piece of it.
Region of conflict, when I think of that, if it's more now than other times, I'm thinking of futurism. I'm thinking of European avant-garde as it's born on this soil, probably 3-4 hours away from Saloniki at the border of Greece and Turkey now. Adrianopolis is where Marinetti was volunteering as a war journalist before he was so astounded by the sounds of the war that he wanted to explode the graphic layout of his books and call for the sort of destruction of museums in his famous manifesto that was published in Figaro. And that's even, the relationship between media and art already started then at his time. And the same way I'm thinking of the Kostakis collection that is sitting now in Saloniki, I believe, which is such an important constructivist revelation. But to me, you said the art is a regional conflict. I mean, for me, art and the art world is such a forum for humanities. And there is obviously, it's a split world that we are observing right now. In the art world, there's a very sort of massive discursive turn where knowledge production is cherished, much more the market forces. There is definitely an interest in much more dematerialized experiences, the way you mentioned, performance, transmission of ideas, the way maybe closer to music, how emission of ideas can, the experience of art rather than the object of art, which is a split. And then of course there's a whole another world where market forces come in, within which we also see, of course, political statements or anti-market statements, but the relationship between art and market is a eternal story, so it's not a 20th
Let's hope it's not eternal.
21st century. But the way I see it is the art world has become more of a forum, especially for the non-American context, where activists, where academics, where philosophers, where they find more home within it. In a way, it has become a much more richer place, and my job and our jobs is also kind of make sure that the very people and the places that offer sort of socio-economic alternatives to the bottlenecking of humanities can be actually sort of can find home within the art world, and that's a really interesting turn I find in I'm sure in Greece, in Turkey, in Russia, in many parts of the world, activists feel much more home now in the art world, which maybe is not in the case of Museum of Modern Art, but definitely in the biennial circuits that you see globally. So that would be my initial commentary, unless you want me to keep going.
Just in terms of regional things and so on, I mean, you work at Witte, but you also have been involved in Turkey and so on. Now, do you think there are really dramatically different discourses going on in these places, or are they relatively meshed?
I'm from Istanbul,
yeah,
and I sat in the Gezi protests. I left my job in Rotterdam and went to sit in the tents 3 years ago in Gezi, and all my friends who are being affected, artists or non-artists, are very much part of that vocabulary, which is a diminishing vocabulary, which is losing its media distribution, its media outlet, which is, I mean, I sometimes wonder why are we on the wrong side of history now that we're living in the age of thugs and bullies, whether it's America or Russia or China. But the question is also like looking critically of what art is doing and how art is circulating. Art is circulating in a very similar way how data is circulating or drugs are circulating, or sort of looking at the parallel narratives to please the economically inclined. You know, art is not some sort of dreamy space in a ghetto operating in its own dreamy space, but it also has functions of distribution and circulation that is very similar to other commodities, whether it's raw materials, whether it's water, whether it's cosmic energy, you know, it's all forms of circulation. So when you look at the story of art, you also have a whole way of rewriting the history of the world in many ways.
Jamie?
Yeah, so I think the three things that sort of come to mind for me, one, I have a different way into this conversation than I think the one that Rob laid out, and I've never understood the dichotomy of art for art's sake. And I always go back to the Somerset Maugham quote that says, art for art's sake is rather like drinking gin for gin's sake, right? And it doesn't quite make sense to me. So, you know, the artists that I know are human beings who live in the world. They, as human beings, are shaped by the world. Their work is shaped by who they are as human beings, and in turn, their work shapes the world. So it's just, that's not a dichotomy that I find helpful, thing one. Thing two, thinking specifically about this notion of art and conflict, I go back to an anthropologist called Alika Wally, who works at the Field Museum in Chicago, and she's actually found that both artist and arts participant function as master identities. So people who make art and people who experience art form relationships across race, across ethnicity, across country of origin, across gender, across socioeconomic status, and they create bonds that endure beyond the art experience. So that art is actually one of the most powerful ways of making durable bonds between unlike groups. So I think it actually has a very powerful role to play in the notion of conflict. And then the third thing that I would say is that unpacking the Elvis example that Rob laid out is, yes, there are aesthetic questions about a white man telling the African American experience. In addition to that, there are power and economic dimensions of that, and the fact that he was creating art within a system that let a white man tell that story and that let a white man profit from it. So in addition to the aesthetic dimension, there's also very real power and economic dimension. So those are three things that I would offer to open up the conversation.
And since you're nodding actively, why don't you just nod in?
Terrific, I'm just nodding away. So my way into this conversation is actually by way of 5th century Athens. My project, Theater of War, presents ancient Greek tragedies about war to military audiences who've experienced war. And the idea behind the project is that ancient Greek theater, and theater in particular in the Western world, was born as a military technology, a vast, expansive public health initiative that happened to utilize the arts on a very large scale. So picture 17,000 citizen soldiers seated in the theater of Dionysus during the 5th century BC, in a century in which the Athenians saw nearly 80 years of war. They're seated according to tribe, which is their military unit, according to rank, with the generals, the strategoi in the front, and the hoplite cadets in the nosebleed section in the back. And they're all watching plays that either implicitly or explicitly deal with topics that really only those who've been to war intrinsically understand. You have a view of one lens into what ancient theater was. So now fast forward 2,500 years to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We, in the United States, had a cohort of tens of thousands of service members returning from the wars, struggling with invisible wounds, and really an unprecedented sort of problem on our hands. We also had more than 44,000 people coming back from the conflicts who would have died in any conflict prior because of advances in modern medicine. So we had this vast subclass of people who are neither well nor sick, but stranded on islands of chronic illness, who need to be brought back into the fold of their community. Well, the Athenians offer a model that we have lost touch with in the Western world, at least in the United States, I can speak for, which is about the communalization of the pollution of conflict by bringing the entire community together to bear witness to the horror, to the trauma, to the ethical and moral breaches, to the infighting, to the betrayals that are fundamental to military conflict and its consequences. So our work, we use the best actors in the United States and also now in Europe. We don't compromise on the artistic quality of what we produce. We do not aspire to be of the tribe for whom we're performing, nor do we exploit their stories. We perform the plays as a way of creating the context for a conversation that wouldn't have happened otherwise in the audience. It's really just a pep rally for a discussion that wouldn't have happened, where people open up, tell stories about trauma, about what we call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicide, the impact of war on families. And now this work has grown to 15 other projects that all use this idea, this methodology, that ancient stories and ancient plays in particular can be used as public health initiatives to deliver one fundamental message, which is if you relate to anything in these stories, you're not alone. and you're not just not alone in your community, as evident by the conversations that occur because of this intervention and because of the performance, but most importantly, you're not alone across time. And what we see night after night is palpable relief in audiences that discover that. Audiences who've experienced war on both sides of the fence. We've performed this work in prisons, homeless shelters, mental institutions, addiction clinics, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, for the guards, the CIA. We've done it for people in regions of conflict, in Europe, in Japan. And everywhere we go, you know, at least I'm reminded of the unique power of theater as a technology, as refined as Athenian architecture, as a 5th century art, as refined as the political systems and the legal systems that developed during that quantum leap that happened humanistically during that century, as refined a technology as there is, for delivering an experience that, as Jamie articulated so beautifully, is boundary dissolving, that dissolves the boundaries between those who come to see it. And so that's how I entered the conversation. Some people have questioned whether our work is ethical for all the reasons you've laid out, and we can talk about that if that's of interest. And of course, this question of arts for art's sake is something that fuels my desire to make sure that the experience we're delivering is the highest quality artistic experience while simultaneously delivering the social impact that we hope. And so we have now 200 actors who participated in our projects who are all very famous, who come back to the work time after time, because it's very rare in our profession to feel like you're doing anything that's of social meaning with your craft. And to see the palpable benefits it has on a community brings this group over and over back to be deployed out into the world in various places. So in a nutshell, that's my response and my way in.
Let me take another tack. If I understand it from yesterday's conversation after the film that you showed, you've also made a film about Cavafy. And Cavafy was one of the more solitary artists. I think Fernando Pessoa, the artist from, the poet rather, from Portugal, is another example of these extraordinarily solitary figures who make entire universes in small, exquisite works of art. And when we say art for art's sake, it doesn't mean necessarily some kind of rarefied, aristocratic thing. It is simply that to dream itself is a kind of freedom, and that you can make a small artifact that is available to everybody should it find its way to them, or should the viewer find their way to it, and that is itself a kind of liberating act. And I wonder if you could talk about your interest in Cavafy, about what his role is now, because certainly he's much more widely read now than at any time that I can think of. There are about 5 translations in English.
Yeah, the new one is Daniel Mendelssohn, is it?
Yeah.
The New York Exquisite, actually, a translation where he's managed to capture the cadence of the language and the rhythms of the Greek. He's actually transported that, transposed that into the English language. It's no small achievement on the part of that particular translator. I mean, when we're talking about regions of conflict or whatever, it's not just a geographical thing or left, right, or whatever. I mean, Cavafy is actually working in Alexandria. Late 19th century, early 20th century. He's discovered by Foster and stuff like that. But his region of conflict really is his sexuality. I mean, he's the first contemporary, we would say, literary figure who's completely open about his sexual identity in a very parochial, closed, petit bourgeois, Alexandrian kind of diasporic community, and an enormous sense of kind of isolation. And he's writing this sort of stuff, which for me is an incredibly kind of political act, as well as an act of very high aesthetic kind of quality. And he's completely alone. He comes to Athens in 1903, and he's more or less kind of like ridiculed, in fact, by the literary establishment that prefers this enormous kind of epic, grandiose national narrative. And he's writing in a very personal, and his own kind of Greek, actually. It's a mixture between contemporary spoken Greek and a kind of form of katharevous, archaicized Greek, you know. So it's this incredibly beautiful language, and he's really totally on his own. It is art for art's sake. It's a form of kind of presumably psychotherapy for this civil servant working for the water supply ministry, I think, in Egypt. whatever. But the reverberations of his work over the last century and a half, I think, is quite incredible. In terms of the role of the artist or whatever, I really am very much about, the artist has to be completely skeptical and critical and oppositional to any forms of power, for me. No, whether that is mainstream kind of power, whether, that is, if we're talking about the presidency of the United States or the government in Greece or whatever, or the police or but also power, anti-power. Many times the forces that revolt against this power, many times within those forces, there are kind of reactionary sentiments, and there are kind of, and I think just to go along with that, just because, this is the popular will at one particular point in time, is not necessarily a liberating experience, either for the artist or politically. No, we've seen this in the Arab Spring, where this enormous kind of hope and stuff like that was actually frustrated very, very, very early on, and very kind of reactionary, misogynistic, kind of reactionary, anti-gay, whatever sort of stuff was coming out, very anti-democratic, kind of bourgeois democratic kind of sentiments. So in a way, not all reaction against power is necessarily progressive and is necessarily healthy or good. And as artists, we should never be carried away by that. We have our own unique voice, and if we're honest to that, I think we can only be honest to that. I mean, a very brief example, I've done in the last 15 years in Greece a trilogy. I think I finished my cycle of work in the Greek language. I started off in England in the queer movement of the late 80s and the early 90s with Jarman and Julian and all these other people. I moved here because I wanted to transpose that kind of aesthetic experience into what I saw was happening in the Balkans, which very much I thought was the front line after the fall of the communist regimes, this massive kind of influx of different populations from the east, from the north, and whatever. I found that the body of the immigrant, if you like, very kind of seminal in terms of my work. That was criticized in Greece when I first did the film From the Edge of the City, which was work with kind of basically lumpen proletarian kids from Kazakhstan who'd come here as, after the breakup of the Soviet Union. What right do you have to speak on behalf of that? I don't have any right to speak on it. I mean, I actually just lived with these people for a year, these young guys or whatever. They trusted me, and we did this film together, right? So that was my way in. It wasn't about me speaking. And okay, there was a kind of investment, an emotional investment, but that was my take. The second film in this genre was a film called Hostage, and it was based on a true story about a guy who kidnapped a bus and taken all these people hostage, and it ended up in Albania with a tragic result. He and this Greek passenger were killed. Enormous kind of outpouring of rage. What right do you have to do this? How dare you show Greece in a bad light or whatever. Incredible outrage in Albania by the film and the kind of political establishment. How dare you show that this guy has been raped? The idea of male rape. No, this is a complete no-no. So in fact, you're getting it from all different sides, the criticism. The last film, The Spring Awakening, is a film which I think completely goes against the whole crisis narrative that we've been fed and kind of fascinated in Greece for the last 5 or 6 years. The Germans as the wicked, this replication of the present crisis as a replication of the 40s occupation of Greece by the Germans. In effect. The film was kind of, it died. So I think one's independence as an artist is, and perspicacity to see, okay, through official power, but also through the narratives which are ostensibly against power as well. That's my position.
I just throw out that it's odd, it seems to me, that we value the imagination, but then when somebody imagines something that is quote unquote not theirs, the imagination becomes immediately suspect.
Yes.
It's one thing to question the way in which somebody who does not belong to a particular community or whatever it is imagines, but it's ultimately what the imagination is about. It's about taking yourself out of yourself to someplace else. And I think all criticism is fair, but a priori condemnation, because one is not a member of a particular group, defies exactly what Jamie's talking about, which is this ability to dissolve boundaries, to place oneself outside of one's own world, and to welcome people from outside of one's own world into one's own world. Could you talk about your project with Asylum in Pittsburgh, and talk a little bit about Pittsburgh too, as a place to do it? Pittsburgh is kind of the Thessaloniki of Pennsylvania.
An airplane It's 7 hours in the car southwest of New York.
Yeah.
Since everybody knows where New York is. And we're an hour or a mile from the center, a 20-minute walk from the center of the city in a tiny little neighborhood. It is a very mixed neighborhood, high incidence of poverty at the same time. It has a well-developed, sort of preserved neighborhood that's very historic. Our mission is not to create art per se, but is to provide sanctuary to writers who were persecuted in exile because of their writing, particularly their literary writing in our case. So we're a platform for making sure that their voices are not silenced by exile, and at the same time creating audiences in our community for a complete variety of artists who may be from many, many countries, in a community where the city has 4% non-native born in the entire city. So we're a city where essentially racial identity is the only difference other than economic. And there's a high correlation of socioeconomics and race. So our community is roughly 50% African American, 50% white, 30% below poverty in wealth. So our mission is to, which we accidentally discovered through the power of art. When we began, the first writer was a Chinese writer who had been in exile, not been allowed to publish, and he'd been in prison for long periods. And when he came, he put his poetry on the outside of the house. And as you can imagine, in a neighborhood where there are a lot of abandoned homes on the street, it created some attention. And people began to ask, what is that? And he began to perform his house. He was a great reader of his poetry. Anybody would come by, he would go, it's only 2 words that he knew, okay. That's 1 word, I guess. And he would perform and act out his house. And it began to get attention. And so we started to roll with that, what was happening, because we really hadn't intended to do anything other than provide sanctuary. And we created a set of programs that dealt with literary-based performance, readings, authors, and eventually jazz and collaboration. And we had a couple, I would say, core commitments. One of them was we changed our program, which originally provided economic stipend, housing, medical benefits, translations, help for the family if there was a family, from a limited program to one that had no limits. We took away all the borders on that side. And for audiences, everything is free. So we have total access. And a lot of our performances are on public streets, in vacant lots, gardens, so that the public feels in our community that this is part of their space, part of their performances. And what we found is you can very much underrate the imagination of people in a community where there's almost no presence of other languages. We have people reading in Mongolian in public. You name the language, they've done it. And when I cut back on some of the poetry or jazz poetry last year, I got complaints that that's why people came. And so we've seen then, to go to the other point of artists representing communities, clearly the community where people come from, there are a whole set of issues of how you communicate and how you communicate back. Within our community, though, we've done a series of projects dealing with everybody from communities of disability, refugees in our city, and we have artists work with them. And in many cases, we might use focus group transcripts unedited, so the artist samples from them, but doesn't write the language, but begins to assemble dialogues of people who do not communicate with one another, who are on opposite sides. Maybe one may be a fair housing advocate, and may one be homeless and living in the YMCA. Another may be a historic preservationist. They're in these songs talking to one another, and in the audience, listening to the people have dialogue. And for people with disabilities, we did a project with a director from France who had something called the Micro-History of World Economics Danced, which was essentially an economic lesson, the history of economics, and how we got to the point of crisis with 50 people with disabilities and their families, service givers, writing real-time text. He did writing workshops as part of the performance, and being recognized as real actors, real performers, as integral to the performance, not as representing disability. And but talking about crisis in human life and human scale. And eventually, the whole community kind of begins to embrace the values of free expression and creative expression, which are deeply embedded in US values to start with, but tend to be forgotten in many ways and taken for granted and cheapened by sort of self and commercial censorship. And we did a project with the writer from Venezuela who was in exile with some artists that the community picked from a set of proposals, which I poo-pooed. I thought this was really stupid. And I tried to get people not to do it. And it was called River of Words. And some Venezuelan artists, the novelists picked words from Venezuelan poets and novelists. They fabricated them in various fonts and materials. And we threw parties and invited people to give a home to a word like we give a home to a writer, and the artists would put them on their houses. So we threw these parties. They were really popular. People loved it. This was supposed to be temporary. So they said to the artists, can we keep these forever? We like our words. They would argue about, this is me. I'm a vortex, people say. So they say, fine. The words go up on the houses, and I get a letter from the city about a month later saying, who gave you permission in the historic neighborhood? This violates all the standards. You're going to have to take these down. So I said to the city, they're not ours anymore. Don't bother.
You should have said there's a word for that. And then
yeah, and they said, don't be cute. And so I said, how about if we compromise and we tell people they've got to fork over $100, go down and have a hearing at the Historic Review Commission, and bring some neighbors and testify how these are positive, et cetera, et cetera. So we write the letter to everybody that said, if you're in there. So one person's a lawyer. Well, the community association rebels. They say, these are our words. This is what our community is about speech. The historic preservationists say they're fine. They're historically okay. Some journalists who live in the neighborhood begin to give the finger to the city in their articles in the major papers. So somebody goes down who's a lawyer who has a word on his house and fights the case. City says, maybe we got to send this up to legal. Come back again in a couple months. A couple months go by, have another hearing. So they punt and they say, community, come back to us with a standard. And we will then review the standard, which was several years ago now, which was a way of saying, let's let these words live, and we don't want to have to change an official ruling. So now we've got a community that has adopted these values because people have come in, and it's become integral to the identity that communities who are different can be learned to have dialogue together and not always agree. I mean, because these are very sometimes volatile. And to sort of bring it around, the second writer who came to our program was from El Salvador. He wrote a book called Senselessness, which begins with a novelist who thinks he's got a really cushy job. A friend of his says, come on and do a hack job on these manuscripts for us that the churches put together on the Guatemalan massacres from the Indians. They were translated, and we just need someone to brush them up. So he gets about a paragraph into it, and the phrase, I'm not complete in the mind, occurs. And he goes into a delirium. And the whole novel comes from this delirium of languages that can't be translated, massacres that just take over his imagination, and this idea of writers being able to engage in that central space that's not their own space, but translating experience, I think is integral to the imagination in artists, and it can't be denied. And to say that there's high art, low art, is one of the jazz musicians says, they're all on the plate.
With that as a segue, if we can go to Amel, and this was her video, and she was in it several times. And if I am correct in seeing what I'm seeing, there are patches of music in multiple styles. And the fact that you as an artist, as a singer, as a composer, impersonate what looked to me like sort of 1930s Egyptian cinema in one case, or in another case, it's hip-hop style and so on. This ability to sort of morph and also to use music television as a medium for talking about larger issues is something that interests me a lot. Because when we talk about art in relation to regions of conflict, we tend to talk about some version of the official art world. It could be theater, it could be the art market, it could be this. But this is an area which is open for all kinds of interventions. And Amel speaks French, understands English, but speaks French, so we're going to have to do this in translation.
Hello, everybody. My name is Amel, and it means hope. And today my quiz is with my English. So I hope you will understand that I have to switch to French sometime to be more precise. What I have to say today is the crisis of an artist is not to be in crisis. So the crisis motivates and frees sensitivity. For example, for me, the crisis appear like this. يا غربتي في بلاد الناس جميع من يجوز يقول لنا So this song talks about people who are exiled and outside of their countries, and for me, the exiles can be geographial or can be physical, but the worst one is to be exiled in its own society. Donc, je vais switcher au français pour parler un peu de l'exil. Pour ce qui s'agit de l'exil, c'est comment aujourd'hui un artiste se sent exilé dans sa propre société, ne se sent pas compris, se sent à côté de la marge, c'est-à-dire qu'il est à un moment donné confronté à une dynamique sociétale qui active à contre-courant. Et c'est là où devient l'art un moteur intéressant, une thérapie, une interprétation d'un message artistique et aussi sociétal qui engendre justement le déclic pour le changement.
What you would like to say is that actually sometimes the artists feel marginalized from their own society, from their own community, so they feel that they go against the wave, and perhaps sometimes art is the way that they can express themselves and in some cases also create a new wave and go against this wave and become the driver for a change.
Yes. Et puis pour ce qui s'agit du public, donc le public commence à prendre confiance dans l'œuvre artistique une fois qu'il se reconnaît dans l'œuvre artistique et qu'il se sent justement acteur principal de cette œuvre même. Donc l'artiste va raconter les souffrances de ce peuple, va aussi raconter les tabous d'une société, les problèmes sociaux, les traditions, hein, tout ça. Donc le public s'attache à l'œuvre artistique et responsabilise justement l'artiste autant que porte-parole de son message et attend beaucoup de choses de l'œuvre artistique. Donc aujourd'hui, moi, en tant que jeune de la nouvelle génération de la scène musicale algérienne, je me sens un peu responsable de porter un message d'une société qui est en pleine dynamique et qui est en plein changement. Et je vous laisse... Oui.
Please correct me if I remember everything.
Yes.
So at the beginning she said that the artist, the public gets a habit of the art and the artist, and so slowly gets acquainted to this and then accepts the art. And at the end of this process, the artist through his art will give the responsibility to the public, will express their needs, their taboos, their problems.
Mm-hmm. And the artist became an actor of the changement, and it's collaborate with the artistic production and to make the change in the society. And Qu'est-ce que je pourrais parler de la vidéo qu'on a vue? C'est les exemples des artistes nord-africains. Donc, je voudrais aussi citer le Arab Spring, donc, qui a touché un peu nos pays africains tels que l'Égypte et la Tunisie.
Say a few words about the video we just saw. It's about various artists from her region. It's all somehow inspired by the Arab Spring.
Yes. Donc, comme vous avez vu pour la première, c'était Amel qui était un premier personnage de la révolution tunisienne et qui a porté fort justement le message de la liberté d'expression et de son engagement pour le changement d'une dictature et pour plus de liberté dans la société.
The first artist was from Tunisia. He was one of the first persons to take up also during the revolution in Tunisia, and what he expressed was messages from the freedom of expression.
And now his song Kalimti Hurra, which means my word is free in English, became a hymn of the Tunisian revolution. I can, for example, talk about General Lebled, a young rapper who talked about the situation in Tunisia too, and he expressed his disagreement to the president, and he will incarcerated for 3 days because he put the video in YouTube. I can talk about Rami Aissam from Egypt with his song Mahnash min dul wala dul, which means we don't belong to them. C'est-à-dire, on ne veut pas qu'on récupère notre révolution, on ne veut pas qu'il y ait une mauvaise interprétation ou carrément une récupération politique de notre investissement.
So what he wanted to say is that we don't want
Turn the mic up.
So what the artist would like to say is that we don't want to change the meaning of our revolution and not be misinterpreted.
Yes. For me, as far as I'm concerned, the topic I do in my work is to talk about the freedom of speak, the women's rights, the identity. I talk about the generation gap. Je viens d'un pays qui a été colonisé pendant 132 ans, qui est l'Algérie. Le peuple a donné de son sang pour avoir son indépendance en 1962. Donc,
she comes from a country which was for 130 years a colony and only in 1962 became an independent state.
Et juste après l'indépendance, l'Algérie n'a pas fini son combat, donc elle est rentrée dans d'autres mouvements de résistance tels que le Berber Spring en 1980. Et le Berber Spring, c'est un mouvement de berbères qui justement exprime par l'œuvre artistique de Ma'toub el-Wennes qu'on a vu dans la vidéo, qui raconte donc cette appartenance à cette identité volée de tout le territoire nord-africain, pas que de l'Algérie.
But the story of her country doesn't stop in 1962, but there have been other conflicts during the coming years. One example is the Berber Spring,
yes.
The Berber Revolution.
Yes, in 1980, with Ma'toub el-Wennes, who wants to make the Amazigh identity official. He was assassinated in 1995, and today the Amazigh language is national official language in Algeria.
Okay, I'd like to throw out something more general conversation. When you spoke, you talked about the avant-gardes of the teens and 20s. There was also a whole other set of avant-gardes in the visual arts and in the performing arts in the 60s and 70s. And most of them chose the path of austerity. The denial of pleasure was their means of countering what was thought to be bourgeois artistic standards, right? And it was an act of taking away from arts things that were too easy for the audience to enjoy without being critical of society. But in regard to what Constantine was saying, one of the artists I admire the most is Felix González Torres. who was an American-Cuban artist who figured out that the best way to be radical was to create pleasures that people didn't know they wanted and that understood only after they were in the process of savoring them. Literally, he would make pieces out of candy, and people would eat the candy, and while they were eating the candy, they would be informed that this represented the body of his lover who had died of AIDS. Now, I would like to talk about the change in attitudes towards the politics of pleasure, the insinuation of meaning into things that are easily enjoyed but hard to think about, and how that as a strategy for the politicizing of art has grown.
That's all you.
I mean, it's split worlds again.
Yep.
Because, you know, there's so much politics that's embraced within the art world. And that's what I mean is artists identifying an issue and an urgency, then creating a whole group of communities and stakeholders around that issue, and then galvanizing a whole discussion around that issue. So it could be in the form of an archive that has never existed for Tibet, or it could be a project, a research project that was 10 years ago in archaeology, which was covered yesterday. You know, should we cover up the excavation sites? I mean, this is a discussion I've been following in the art world about 10 years ago, which I'm sure in archaeology it's been forever, it just came up again yesterday. Or it could be a parliament that's being built at the moment by an artist in Kurdish part of, in Rojava, in Kurdistan. So artists are very much involved with the urgency of the now and immediately responding. But there are also other artists who completely work with aesthetics and beauty and somehow tangentially riffing on the pleasure idea, I guess, which is...
Or maybe not so tangentially, forbidden pleasures.
And it's you know, working with the politics of NSA, but completely presenting it in a gorgeously seductive object form, in a way, in a museum setting, to the point that some artists would say, oh, he's selling out to the politics of, or to the world of, pleasure. Or, you know, artists who look at the dynamics of warfare from the Belgium to the African colonies, or artists who look at, you know, fiber optics politics under the water between continents, artists who look at Djibouti military training camp of CIA and so forth, in a way that it only goes to the collection of Leonardo DiCaprio. So, I mean, there are many, many contradictions that need to be kept in mind when trying to make sense of the art world's undercurrents. And I don't need to tell you that, because you know it more than anybody. You should be a speaker here rather than a moderator. I think that's kind of the extent I can go into the domain of pleasure, given how politically charged everything else is for our world. I don't even know where I would be able to start with that question.
The only thing I might add is I am not aware of any forces that work on artists that don't also work on every other member of society. So when Amel was talking about feeling marginalized, I think there are many people who feel marginalized. I think the difference with artists is that they are bringing symbol and sensation to what they are experiencing. And when we're thinking about conflict, I think we're often talking about social change. And when we're thinking about social change, there are 5 S's that I think are part of that. And the first 3 are symbol, structure, and scale. The first 3 are structure, scale, and system, right? System, scale, and structure. And we all recognize that, and that's how many of us operate. The magic that artists bring is bringing that symbol and sensation to make something that makes intellectual sense all of a sudden make sense on a gut level. And I think you've experienced that in your world. Psychologists and doctors can talk about what the men and women who've been in war are feeling about, but all of a sudden you take a great playwright, an addict playwright, and they're able to sort of bring system and structure to it. So I think, so again, it's that artists, I think, are able to bring something to the table having experienced the same things that all of their other colleagues have. So that is maybe what I would throw.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say the 2 sides of my mouth. On the one hand, just narrowing the focus of what I do to, say, public health. I mean, one of the principal objects of our work is mental health. around which globally there's massive stigma. How do we break down that stigma? In the communities in which we perform and work, there's a pervasive view that anyone who suffers from something, mental health issues that result from trauma, it's a sign of weakness. It's something we've, in the United States, have culturally conditioned. All kinds of arguments that sort of victimize the person who's experiencing the trauma. So if we're going to affect major change with regard to mental health and stigma, we have to mainline it in a way that can be consumed by a mass populace. So our work, we're actually collaborating with a video game company on a project that would include actual psychological consequences to gameplay that involves warfare. Now, that's nefarious sounding. The United States Army had a recruiting video game called America's Army that utilizes some of the same technology. But if we're going to actually affect whole-scale public health change with regard to how people view the consequences of warfare, we have to work within forms that can be consumed on a mass level. The flip side is the work that we do resists consumption. So we deliver in the theater an experience that's so jarring, so horrifying, so hard to consume that you really can't, it's totally inappropriate to do what my actors do in the commercial or nonprofit theater. No one would necessarily pay money to have that experience until they've had the experience of communalizing it, of a community coming together. So it's both. I mean, I think in the theater, I can speak only to that. Most people go to the theater. I mean, I've spent some time in Greece this year, and I think I could say about my experience in Greece the same as I can in the United States. For the most part, to feel more intelligent than they actually are, to be congratulated for their own political beliefs, to be part of a community of people who are all consuming this particular art form together. So what is our responsibility as theater artists? We want to continue to engage a large audience, but simultaneously, are we simply just making things for people to consume and derive pleasure from? And how do we, social impact seems to split the difference. If we can affect change by delivering pleasure, then maybe that's, the best of all worlds.
Constantine?
I'm not sure I understood the question, actually.
Go ahead.
Could you just repeat the, sorry.
Repeat my question?
Yeah.
I can't remember which question I had most recently.
Something about seduction, I think.
It's about the politics of pleasure, basically.
Right.
There has often been a kind of puritanical attitude towards pleasure among people who are proposing radical rethinking of the world. And pulling back and denying pleasure to audiences was their way of disciplining those audiences.
Well, kind of Spanish Inquisition.
On the other hand, pleasure itself is a subversive tool and is sometimes...
Totally.
So.
Yeah, all art has to be seductive. I think, isn't that the key in the success over decades, over the last century of Hollywood, the absolute seduction of, you're creating a new series of gods and goddesses, and they're called stars, and you go into this like enormous black space, dark space, and you fall in love with these people. That's seduction, and that's part of that's the ultimate seduction.
Is, yeah.
You create a love affair with these movie stars or whatever, and that's the power of it. I think there is space, I think, for stuff which is very, very harsh and very minimal and very austere. But that's also a seduction in a different way. It can actually work as a seduction at a cerebral level, yeah? Mm-hmm. The whole idea of less is more, the whole idea of denial. Mm-hmm. And you can get into that kind of trip as a form of seduction. But clearly, I think, from, the most ancient statue or the most ancient kind of relief to the most contemporary form of digital cinema or video art or whatever. If there is no seduction, I don't think there is any possibility of that thing being called art or it actually functioning on the viewer. That's it.
Okay, in the interest of time, because we're a little behind, I thought maybe we should now open it to the floor for people to ask questions that they may have. I might have one more, but I will hold my fire until you have had a chance to speak up. Somebody? There's one over there, and there's one over there. So.
No.
we go. Hello. Yeah. So I really enjoyed. I'm going to slaughter your name because I wasn't here at intros. Maybe is it Defne? It's just okay. Easy enough. Thanks. So I really enjoyed what you were saying about the struggle of trying to make art accessible with issues like the NSA and political issues. I think an example that I enjoyed, just a very quick statement, was Jenny Holzer's work with Protect. I thought that blew my mind. But I think for a lot of us that are kind of in our channels with our work internationally, we're kind of, it's like our music libraries aren't as cool as they used to be, and we're missing out on a lot of great experiences. Are there pieces that are as engaging or more engaging that we should check out on these kind of really heavy social political issues that you feel are successful? And that's really for the whole panel, but I think starting with Defne, because I thought she kind of hit the nail on the head with the NSA.
I think so. And what's happening I run a space, and my mandate is to support projects that are beyond the white walls. So when artists are operating in that in-between space where philanthropy should probably kick in much more and research and identify those projects, and there are foundations like Prince Claus Fund and so forth that go into that space. I find it interesting to identify and find artists and support, which is sometimes not really part of their regular work either. An artist like Paola Pivi, who you can find in every institutional setting or in every other art fair and so forth, when she comes up with an idea that doesn't fit within that matrix, but that is actually a total social justice project or a massive cultural heritage project. Those are the projects that we should really identify and look and support. So that's where, there's a project called Silent Academy by an artist, Kurdish artist from Diyarbakir, Ahmet Öğüt, which is making use of all the skills of the legal migrants in the European cities, or also in New York now. The taxi drivers who happen to be a lawyer or a computer programmer, every man of the day that we get to chat in the taxi, but making use of their skills because, nothing wrong with being a taxi driver, but life kind of took them to that destiny, and he's kind of creating academy to tap into their skills. There are projects, and I would like to actually see even more.
Tanya Bruguera also has taken on the whole question of immigration as a social activist. Yeah. So.
Just two super quick ones. There's a visual art collective called Ghana Think Tank, which is doing some of the most interesting work I've run across. And in the theater space, there's a theater collective called Rimini Protocol. And specifically, they've done a series in different cities called 100%, and then the name of that city. I saw the one they did in Philadelphia. They've done it globally, and it's probably the piece of theater that stayed with me most. So look them up, and I'll let them speak for themselves.
And one thing I want to add is also what you said, Constantine, which I find the queering of politics, or looking at political mechanisms and challenging them. And obviously that is one of the ulterior motives of many artists. Mm-hmm. But on the other side, when they don't have the media outlet, or when the media is clamped, let's say, within their respective contexts, and when they cannot circulate their ideas because they are not connected to institutional networks or media networks, that's where we should also play more of a sensitive.
Well, even if they are connected to these media outlets and whatever, sometimes there's a kind of a silent censorship that comes into play. So someone who may be established or whatever at a certain point is considered maybe beyond the pale.
And that's also where philanthropy could make a difference, because there's almost no support for art writing and for the ways in which interpretive exercises can get out to a larger public. Most of the writing that's in the mainstream press now is about prices. And it doesn't do any good whatsoever for the general viewer who's saying, what is this, why is this, what's going on, who's it intended for? And one of the problems with art is that artists must choose their audiences, but if those audiences are blocked because they never hear about it,
Well, part of our mission is to actually translate the work of the writers in exile and to make sure they find audiences. So we work with publishers of translations. We have a magazine online that now has worldwide contributors of exiled writers to get their texts into print and interviews, and so they can find publishers, and in effect building our own market system of distribution. And it is really important to do that.
There was somebody's hand raised over here, and I don't know whether they're still. Okay, now please.
Hello to all of you. Thank you very much for your inspiring discussion. I would have a question and a comment at the same time. Yesterday we heard extensively the use of the term narrative. If we recall Harald Zeman, an outstanding curator and art historian, we might remember his exhibition of 2003, Blood and Honey, The Future is in the Balkans. In terms of narrative, it remained quite unfulfilled and underdeveloped since he died some 2 years after the show. And in any case, it would be a narrative or a discourse, if you prefer, of 2003. In 2016, and after your discussion, the narrative or discourse, or how we may call it, seems much more complex than the one based on the notion of conflict. In that sense, which would be the keywords of the reality, of the current artistic reality that is of interest to you? Maybe which would be the keywords of the current sensations that artists bring and are of interest to you? Thank you.
Who would like to grab that one? I'll have something to say on this one, but before I open my mouth, anybody else want to jump in?
No, I would defer to the curators.
I mean, I think problems are much more hidden right now and much more structural and not as visible and easily identified as they used to be years ago. And I'm also talking about asymmetric warfare, and I'm talking shadow finance, which came in Andrea's statement yesterday, and so forth. So it is also much more invisible than immediately addressable.
I just say for myself, and it's at a different level, if you will, of the topical issues of warfare and hidden finance and so on and so forth are very big and very real and very worth making art about, and sometimes the art that's made about it is really good. But there's another simpler proposition which I extract and probably creatively misread that comes from Mikhail Bakhtin, who is the Russian literary critic and thinker, who basically said that all art is dialogic, by which he means basically it arises out of a conversation between parties. The general understanding of this is that it's a conversation between the reader and the author. But it begins in a conversation that the author has with him or herself. And it begins, therefore, in a disagreement within the author. The author argues back and forth with him or herself about issues of concern to them. And what they then do, and usually he talks about Dostoevsky creating characters that represent these opposing points of view, and so as you read a Dostoevsky novel, you listen to these arguments, but they're all projections of an internal contradiction, disagreement, discomfort, whatever you want to call it. And I think basically art offers the occasion for people who are convinced that they must have a position to realize that actually all positions are contested, and they're even contested by the most verbally skilled or pictorially skilled of people, and that what you want from a work of art is not the answer, but rather a better level of argument than you're able to create for yourself, giving you therefore a model of how to do it.
Walt Whitman said we contain within us multitudes.
That's right, yeah.
And I think that you can also then begin to look at the reader or the audience from the same perspective. And this goes to maybe sweetening a little bit, but it's an inversion. During G20 in Pittsburgh, we had 17 exiled Burmese monks with us. And they were going to do a prayer march into the center of the city where all the presidents were meeting. And we didn't have a permit. So we walked in, and it was basically an armed city. There were police on mounted horsemen, busloads with all the, because it was right after Seattle. And everywhere they went, people were coming down off the horses, the police taking photographs, and it became a piece of performance art. And they didn't know they were in performance art. we didn't know it until it began to happen. And so the whole meaning of this completely changed. They sat down and did a 45-minute kind of prayer outside the convention center where everybody was, and everything stopped and became quiet in that environment. So this idea of the audience beginning to then embrace other points of view and containing within multitudes, I think, is also the audience learns to do that as well.
And I think it affects, I mean, MoMA was invoked, and since Jamie and I both worked there, and since it's the mother of all museums of modern art, almost in a literal sense, genetically, you know, it's also an easy target. It's easy to make fun of. But the truth of the matter is that when I go to MoMA, I don't hear the authoritative position of modern art. I hear a whole bunch of artists arguing with each other about what modern art ought to be. And so when people go there, they should not be going there as a treasure house or as some kind of religious experience or whatever. They should feel like they're entering into that argument. And they can also begin to think that it doesn't matter what they like and don't like. It matters the quality of the argument that they listen to and that they participate in. And one of my experiences as a curator is that people start out hating something and then they come back to it over and over and over again. The number of people who start out by thinking Warhol is the absolutely bottom of everything and then end up finding that Warhol is actually kind of brilliant is significant. The number of people who look at white paintings and think there's nothing there and then keep coming back to look at them is also a case of that. So if we think of our cultural institutions that are heavy, if you will, as being not so heavy after all, they're there for ordinary people to enter into the argument and then participate in that argument. They're forums, they're not treasure houses.
And the only thing, just not to keep beating a drum, but at the moment, MoMA and most museums, at least in the US, are inviting in that debate and argument among a very narrow band of voices. Right,
And
so there's a very narrow band of the spectrum that's invited, that is canonized and said this is the conversation to which everyone should be entering. So MoMA and all the museums are making great strides, but I think we need to be aware of how much of the debate is actually housed within those marbled walls.
And they're managing the debate because they're giving voiceovers so that people don't even have the chance to have that primary experience of being estranged, confused, and having to figure it out for themselves. They're being told right away what to think about things because the argument is that that is more democratic. It is less democratic.
For those poor white men who get to hang
For anybody,
MoMA's
for
walls.
anybody.
Right, those poor Bissett.
Yeah.
One of the questions at the center of my work is whose stories are these? What I love most about Greek tragedy is if you do it right, if you direct it right, then everyone is right. Everyone is justified. Every character in a Sophoclean play is perfectly justified in what they're doing. So our next big project this summer is August 6th. We're performing Antigone with a multiracial cast in the church in Ferguson, Missouri, where Michael Brown, who was gunned down by the police 2 years ago, where his memorial took place for 2,500 people. And the audience will be split between the African-American community and law enforcement. And the governor of the state of Missouri is committed to bringing the law enforcement community in. And the choruses of Antigone will be sung by a split choir of the gospel choir of the church and the St. Louis Police Choir. And the idea is not about coming at race from the front, because that'll never work in art in the United States, but to talk about what happens when personal conviction and state law are opposed and violence is going to ensue one way or the other, and talk about as a community how do we avert that violence. We're not hoping for a kumbaya moment where everyone holds hands. We're actually just hoping that people, for a brief boundary dissolving moment, 45 minutes after the performance, can hear one another's arguments without it becoming an incendiary shouting match, which is what most town hall discussions are, at least in the United States.
Yeah, Constantine.
Just going back to the your previous question, because I'm a bit slow on seduction, and
I just talked
so
too
I'm
fast,
going back there really.
Slow seduction.
So I've kind of been slightly filtering this word. I remember the Susan Sontag article she was writing sometime in the 90s. She wrote that article about the difficulty of the modernist project, somehow, and how the audience, in terms of architecture and in terms of music and all that, in a sense had rejected the kind of the difficulty of the modernist project, or the post-war modernist project. Do we think that this is true, or have audiences become a lot more sophisticated? Has this modern art, like in terms, I go to the Tate Modern, and what I see is really, instead of people in England, which is a very secular society, instead of going to church, they go to the Tate Modern. you know, and they enter these buildings with the same kind of reverence that one would enter a medieval cathedral.
Which is all wrong.
Which is all wrong. I mean, I'm just wondering, that whole thing around the Modernist project, do you think it is actually more accessible to you know, in the age of Netflix and in the age of YouTube and whatever, is that more accessible to a mainstream audience? Or does the mainstream audience just really still want the good old, which I think is fantastic, narrative and, you know, not the anti-narrative? They don't want the kind of, you know, the romance of the early 60s in France. You know, they don't want Last Year at Marienbad because it's still kind of, but he should be over there, not here, you know, in the editing or what, no?
But I can't resist saying there is no modernist project. There were modernist projects, plural. Yeah. And modernism was an argument about what modernism should be. And it is a triumph of one or two critics in the 1950s to persuade people that this all added up to a streamlined
You don't like
package.
Greenberg, I guess, right?
For example.
Right.
For example. And I think we should disabuse ourselves of that and just drop it, right? And go back to the idea that none of the modernists agreed with one another about anything very much. And that was what was exciting about it. And it, being a member of an audience in which you listen to really, really smart people and talented people argue is a privilege. And it is also a way to hone your own skills in that very department, and not just in art. I don't know, is there anybody else? And otherwise I think we should probably wrap it up.
Yes,
because
they want us to send people to lunch.
We want to send them to lunch, yes. Okay, good. Go.
C'est fini.